Good morning. It's good to see everyone out this morning to worship God and to sing to Him and to sing to one another and lift our voices in praise and to open our Bibles and study more and look at what God has revealed so long ago to mankind. I want to start with this question. What does it mean to give God the glory? What does it mean to give God the glory in everything that we do? What does that look like? How do we do that? What are we talking about when we're saying, do everything to the glory of God? That's the focus of this lesson, and that's what this lesson is going to address. And we're going to address it by talking about food. In 1 Corinthians 10:31, that's where we get this idea of do everything for the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31. It says, "So, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God." So if you're performing an activity for the glory of God, for someone or something, what does that mean? And so the plan of this lesson is we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, because that's the context of what this statement comes from, and that'll give us a little bit of better understanding of what it means, what Paul had in mind when he talked about doing everything to the glory of God. Then we're going to talk about the idea of glory in the Bible and what that means. And then lastly, we're going to think through some applications about this. So, the key text is 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31. We already read it, but let's read it again. "So, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God." Now, the first word of that statement is "so," or some translations might say, "therefore." So what that tells us is that he's building up a conclusion about something. And this is the conclusion. This is the lesson. This is the thing he wants us to understand how we're supposed to live. But he gives 3 chapters of an argument to get up to that point. And so what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, and that's really all one section. It's one big argument. What Paul's really doing is he wants to persuade us, not just tell us what to do. He wants to persuade us, he wants to believe that we need to do what we need to do, not just believe that we have to do what we need to do. And there's a difference there. I think Paul understood that there's a difference. He wants his people in Corinth to actually be persuaded that they need to live in a certain way. Now, before we get into this, there are all types of interpretational controversies among scholars that come up in chapters 8, 9, and 10 of 1 Corinthians involving textual issues or translation issues or just issues about what does Paul mean right here when he says this. And there's no way we're going to be able to get into all of that. But I think we'll be able to see the main point here. So, we're trying to figure out, chapter 10, verse 31, what exactly does Paul have in mind when he says to do everything to the glory of God? Well, if you look at chapters 8, 9, and 10, in 1 Corinthians, he goes through this section starting in chapter 7, saying, "Now concerning the things that you wrote to me," in chapter 7, verse 1. And that what that seems to indicate that he has written up to chapters 1 through 6 things that they haven't wrote to him, and he's talking about what he thinks they need to know. But then chapter 7, he transitions to, okay, now I'm going to answer all your questions. So it looks like that the Corinthians wrote Paul a letter, kind of like a Q&A letter, like asking a bunch of questions and then wanting answers to a bunch of specific issues. It looks like that's what Paul is doing. So he starts with chapter 7, issues about sexuality and marriage. In chapter 8, 9, and 10, it's about food or things offered to idols. They want to know something about food offered to idols, or idol food, or idol things. And really, if you look at it, the more general concept is they're wanting to know, the Corinthians are wanting to know, how do we as Christians now, ex-pagans, who are living in a pagan society, how do we interact with paganism? There's temples all over the place. There's statues of gods all over the place. The very holidays around us are steeped in idolatry, in Greek myth or cults or whatever. People's houses are decorated with idols. When people eat meals, they pray to Jupiter or Ares or Dionysus. How do we interact with all that? Do we just turn a blind eye and just kind of tolerate it and don't really say anything? Just kind of, as we go through those prayers where the other people are leading, we just kind of, okay, well, let's get through this. Or are we supposed to do something else? What do we do when we're eating a meal with these people? What about eating food at an actual idol temple? Temples in that day, they had dining areas that you could go and you could either just eat there, or you could often sacrifice an animal, and then they would use certain parts of the animal to burn up as a sacrifice, and then they would cut the meat, and you would eat part of the meat at the temple, like a meal. And the idea behind that was that you were eating in the presence of whatever God is commemorated by that temple. And so if you go to a temple of Jupiter, then the idea is we're going to offer this sacrifice to Jupiter. Jupiter's going to eat his part, that's the part that's burned up, and I'm going to eat my part, and we're going to have a meal together. And that was a part of worship. That was how pagans in this society in Corinth thought of things. The Christians they grew up with this. They have memories of their childhood, good memories of these type of things and the rituals that they did and the holidays they partook in and all of that. Well, they're having an issue with this. And it looks like different people at Corinth believe different things about this. And Paul's trying to straighten it out. And so, he addresses three main situations in chapters 8, 9, and 10. The first one is eating idol food at an actual idol temple. Eating idol food at an actual idol temple. This is addressed in chapters 8, 7 through 13, and chapter 10, verses 1 through 22. Now, it looks like that's his main topic. Not just eating the idol food, but eating the idol food at an idol temple as part of the ritual. A second situation that he brings up is eating food of unknown history that had been bought in the market. So a lot of times in this culture, the food or the meal, it wasn't always just meat. You could offer any type of food to the gods. And then the leftovers of that food would often be sold to the marketplace, like butchers or cookhouses or taverns or anything like that, or just street vendors. And then they would sell it to just anybody that's just for regular food. So the idea was, okay, so that food was originated for idol purposes. Now it's in the market. Can we eat that? Is that okay? Are we not contaminated by that? Is somehow that idolatry get into its bones and stay with it the rest of its life? Well, that's a question they had. So Paul's going to address that. And he addresses that mainly in chapter 10, verses 23 through 27. Now, the third situation that he addresses is eating food in the private homes of unbelievers or pagans. So, as we can read in chapter 5, verses 9 and 10, Paul says, I don't want you to go out of the world. If I wanted you to do that, then you'd have to go off and live on the mountains of Idaho or something. And make your own culture and society. That's not what I want you to do. I want you to live in the world, but also don't be of it. So that's a challenge. That's a big challenge. And he addresses this issue in chapter 10, verses 28 through 31. So if one of your pagan friends invites you to dinner sometime, are you allowed to go eat with them? Well, that was an issue that they had to deal with. Now, the answers that he gives to these three questions or three situations is that, number one, eating at an actual pagan temple is strictly forbidden. Don't do it. And he'll give some arguments as to why that is. And this is the main focus of the three chapters. That seems to be the issue that's the main issue that's going on, is that you have people in the Corinth church who think since the gods of the idols don't really exist, then it doesn't matter if we go participate in these idol rituals because nothing's happening. It's just the outward, behavior that we're doing with our bodies. I mean, we're just eating there. Yeah, everybody else thinks that these idols are real, but, we know better. So what's wrong with that? So Paul is going to address that. And he says it's forbidden to do that. The second answer he gives is that eating food of unknown history from the market is permitted, is allowed, with certain exceptions. That's where he gets into the third situation. The third answer he gives is don't eat the meal if someone brings the idol connection up in conversation. If someone makes a point about its past history linked with idolatry, then Paul says, then don't eat it. Now we're going to see that in chapter 10, at the end of chapter 10. Now the reasons for these answers. Why is eating at a pagan temple, wrong? Well, Paul basically comes out and says, because it's actual idolatry. So he's going to get into this in chapter 10. In chapter 8 and 9, he terms the argument more in terms of you have to give up things as a Christian. And maybe you think this thing is okay, but someone else doesn't. Or maybe someone else does, but they actually think it's the real thing. Well, when they see you participating in that, what are they going to think about you, or what are they going to think about what's right and wrong? We're going to look at some of those arguments in chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 10, he just gets into, don't do this. Don't eat at idol temples, because that is participating in actual idolatry. And he has to give these reasons why that is, because he knows, and he knows that he's talking to people who know that the gods of the idols don't really exist. They're just statues. So chapter 10, he says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers." So he's continuing an argument here. It's not just a brand new topic. Especially you can see that with the word "for" as he starts with it. "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." Okay, so he's bringing the attention back to Israel in the Exodus and Israel in the wilderness. That's the Old Testament background that he wants them to think, the Old Testament story that he wants them to think. Israel coming out of Egypt, going through the Red Sea as God leads them and rescues them from the Egyptians, and then wandering in the wilderness before they get to the promised land in Canaan. And he's drawing an analogy here. He wants to see some lessons that Christians can learn from those stories, from the story of Israel. And he even brings up the food and the drink aspect here, because he's making that connection. He's showing that this is not a new issue. How to deal with idolatry in society. This is not a new issue. Israel was dealing with it back even in the wilderness wanderings. They were eating spiritual food and spiritual drink. And that was the manna and the provisions that God was giving them. So they were doing all this, and they were participating as not Christians, but as people of God. But it's kind of like, if you think of it in backwards terms, it's kind of like they were Christians. Verse 5, but they had a problem. So they were participating in these activities that had communion with God and fellowship with God in the wilderness. But in verse 5 it says, "Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness." So he's saying, okay, so they were doing all these good things, these good religious things with God at the tabernacle and all of that. They were giving the sacrifices. They were participating in the sacrifices. They were eating the right holiday meals and all of that, Passover, whatever. But most of them, ultimately, God was displeased with their behavior. Why? Well, verse 6, he's going to explain. "Now, these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did." Verse 7, "Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it's written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." That's a citation from Exodus 32, the incident of the golden calf. Notice eating and drinking is there as part of the idol ritual that they were doing with the idol calf. We know what happened to them. We know how God felt about that. Well, verse 8, "We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day." You remember that story? That comes from Numbers 25, where a guy and a girl were doing the thing in a tent somewhere, and then Phinehas got a spear and ran and pinned them to the ground through their bellies. And there was a curse going in the land, in the camp. 23,000 people died that day from that. And one of the main issues was that it was a pagan intermixing with a Jew. And so you have the pagan aspect there, the food and drink aspect there, and he brings in sexuality there as well. Often in the ancient world, sexual acts and idolatry went hand in hand. Sexual acts at a temple was a way to worship certain gods. That's just how it was. That was considered normal back then. Verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. That's coming from Numbers 21. You remember that story. Verse 10, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, these things happened to them as an example. So he's saying, this is why I'm bringing these stories up. Because they serve as anecdotes, examples for how God does things and what God expects of his people. It says, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. He's saying there's a bunch of Israelites who thought they stood with God. They were on good grounding with God. But then overnight, in certain incidents, they just fell away. And you see the wrath of God come out on them. Verse 13, no temptation has overtaken you that's not common to man. It seems to be he's saying, look, the temptations that you are going through right now, with what, especially with what I'm talking about, the pagan stuff, Israel was dealing with that a long time ago. It's a commonality that humans have. It's not unique with certain ages. There's these principles and forces against us in every age that you see. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. And then he says, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. That's how you escape. The temptation is idolatry. What's the escape that God has offered? Flee from it. Now, flee is strong language. It's not just be careful around idolatry. It's not just, be on the guard when you're around idol stuff. No, it's strong language. Flee from it. Run like you're running from a tiger. Verse 15, I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. So he's wanting to persuade them why they don't need to do this. He's going to point to the Lord's Supper as an analogy for why they don't need to eat at idol temples. He says, the cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? That word participation is the word koinonia, usually translated fellowship. The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? So bread, cup, when we partake of that, we are doing something with God. We're doing something with Jesus. It's not just symbolism. We're actually doing something with God. We're participating. We're nurturing the fellowship with Jesus and his people. And he says in verse 7, he's going to emphasize the unity aspect and the unity implications from the Lord's Supper. Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Now, verse 18. Consider, my translation says, the people of Israel. Now, the actual translation is Israel according to the flesh. Israel according to the flesh. There's all kinds of questions. What does he mean by Israel according to the flesh? Well, what it looks like to me in the context is that he's pointing back to Israel in the wilderness that he had just told the stories about. And by using the phrase according to the flesh, which in Paul, that phrase is only used in connection with sin. It's not used just in connection to like physicality or the physicalness of something. It is usually connected to something sinful. Consider the Israel according to the flesh are not those who eat the sacrifices, participants in the altar. So he doesn't say the temple, he says the altar. And what I think he's saying here is, look back at the stories about Israel that we talked about. Numbers 21, Numbers 25, Exodus 32. All these times that they participated in idolatrous acts in the Old Testament, what were they doing? They were participating in the idol altars, whatever they were. In Exodus 32, they even say, this is to Yahweh. So they think they're even worshiping God, the one true God, in their idolatrous acts. And God was still displeased with it. And so verse 19, what do I imply then? So he's expecting them to misunderstand him maybe. And he's trying to clarify something. That food offered to idol is anything, or that an idol is anything. Well, so he's expecting his readers to think, does he think that idols are real? Well, the answer to that is no and yes. No, I imply that they sacrifice, when they sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. Now, my translation, the ESV, has the word pagans there, but it is not in the original text, in most of the original texts. And so some scholars think that it's been entered there because they thought that he's moving from Israel to talking about pagans. But if it's not in the original text, if it just says, no, I imply that what they sacrifice, they offer to demons, not to God, he's still talking about Israel. So I imply that what they sacrifice, and that's how I take it, that what Israel sacrificed when they were doing all those idol things back in the stories that he wanted them to learn, they offer to demons and not to God. So what Paul says is, okay, the idols aren't real, but the idols still represent something that's real. Even though they're not the real gods, it's as if the demons and the demonic forces are coming in and exploiting that. And that's one of the big reasons why Paul is against eating in idol temples. Because there's actually something spiritual that's going on behind the scenes when you go there. And that seems to be a quotation from Deuteronomy 32:17 when he says, they offer to demons and not to God. Deuteronomy 32 is talking about Israel's past when they would participate in idolatrous actions. And Deuteronomy 32 described it as they were offering to demons, not to gods, not actual gods. So it looks like what he's doing is he's saying, look, we're like Israel. He's drawing all these comparisons to ancient Israel. I do not want you to be participants with demons. That's the issue. That's why going to these temples and participating in this stuff is wrong. Verse 21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. And then to kind of finish off the force of his argument, verse 22, shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? So what he's doing here is he's not saying, don't go to these temples or these demons might possess you. He's not saying, don't go to these temples or something might bad happen to you because these demons are really powerful. He's saying, don't go to these temples because there's demons there and God will be angry. That's the idea. So the focus is on how is God going to react to this, not so much how are the demons going to react to it. But I don't know about you, but when I read the Bible, I get the impression that being friends with demons is a bad thing. So shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? So there in chapter 10, verses 1 through 22, he deals with the specific issue of going to idol temples and participating in the meals that are happening there. And he's saying, don't do it. There are dark forces there. God will be angry if you do it. Just because the idols aren't real doesn't necessarily mean anything in that situation. Now, if you look at chapter 10, verses 23 through 30, he's going to address a different situation. He's moving from eating in actual idol temples. And he's going to bring up just eating food in general. And sometimes they might have an idol history. What do you do in those situations? He says in verse 23, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. Now, when he says all things are lawful, it's in scare quotes. And I think the idea is that he is quoting something that they are saying, that they believe, or something of some sort. All things are lawful. That's kind of like a mantra, maybe, that they put that on a poster board and go out outside the Supreme Court and raise it up. All things are lawful, that kind of thing. And Paul's quoting it, and he's like, okay, there's a sense in which all things are lawful. I agree. There's a sense in which I agree with that, but there's a sense in which I disagree with it. So he says, all things are lawful, but with this qualification, not all things are helpful or beneficial. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. So what is he doing? He's saying, okay, what y'all think is that the criteria for what's sin or not is law. He says, it's not just law. Law's part of it, yeah. But there's more to it. There's also the question of, is it helpful? Is it beneficial? Is it edifying? What's the results of this action? That's what he wants them to think. Not just in terms of right and wrong, law, but in terms of helpful, unhelpful, to a certain goal. Verse 24, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Verse 25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. So he's telling them, okay, when you are eating food that used to be in the idol food, it used to be idol food, or maybe it's not idol food, whatever it is, and you buy it from the market, don't ask any question about it. And he says in verse 26, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. He quotes from Psalm 24 there. And the point of that quote is, well, it's not like there's, in creation, it's not like there's idol creation like the idols made this, or the demons made this part of the creation, and then God made this part of the creation. We better not go on that part of the creation because, we don't want to do the demon stuff. That's not the idea. The idea is God created everything. God is the ultimate creator. Now, people and demons, whatever else, they use creation, good creation, warp it. But creation itself is not bad. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. In verse 27, he says, if one of the unbelievers or pagans invites you to dinner and you're disposed to go. So this a pagan friend invites you to come and you go to eat dinner with him. Eat whatever's set before you without raising any questions. Why? On the ground of conscience. What do you mean, Paul? Verse 28, but if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. And then he clarifies, well, whose conscience are you talking about? Verse 29, I do not mean your conscience, but his. So what's the idea here? The idea is, okay, when you are invited to eat at someone's house, and they're a pagan, if someone there brings up the fact that this was a sacrifice to idols, that likely means they think it's important. So whether it's a pagan bringing it up or it's an unbelief or it's a Christian that's with you who brings it up, the Christian's probably thinking, this is wrong. Hey, did you know that this was offered to an idol? You think we should eat it? The unbelievers, he's probably bringing it up because he thinks it's a great thing. Oh, this was offered to Jupiter. You have the pleasure of eating Jupiter's food tonight. I think that's the idea of what he means by if anyone says this was offered to an idol or this was offered as a sacrifice, he says, then don't eat it. Why? It doesn't matter if they bring it up or not. Because if they bring it up, they clearly have an issue, whether it's good or bad. And by you eating it, you are condoning that thing because of the symbolism of it. If the Christian thinks that it's bad or wrong to eat that food and you eat it anyway, then you're encouraging that Christian to eat it as well, especially if it's a weak Christian. If the unbeliever brings it up as if it's a positive thing and you eat it anyway, then he's going to think, they don't have any problem with idolatry. Oh, that's good. We can just do whatever we want with each other. Paul didn't want them to think that. He says, for why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? So what he's saying, I think, here is that, okay, this only applies when other people are around. So you have to think in consideration, what does this guy believe? What does this guy believe next to me when I do things? Because that's going to have implications on their lives. My actions are going to have implications. He said, I'm not talking about your conscience, because you're at liberty to do pretty much whatever you want in these areas, especially when it comes to food, by yourself and without these other people around. But if other people make a deal with it, you need to be watchful of that. Verse 30, if I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? Then verse 31, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Now, defining glory. What was the idea of glory in the ancient world? Well, glory in Hebrew, it literally meant like heavy, something that's heavy. You even see this in kind of played out in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17, when it says that we are waiting for the hope of the weight of glory that we're hoping for as part of our inheritance. He uses that phrase, the weight of glory. So it looks like he's pointing back to the Hebrew, the weight of heaviness, the weight of glory. So think of it like this. You know the feeling that you get when a super famous person walks into the room and you weren't expecting it? There's just some kind of like glow, that this vibe that you get that feels like it just gets into the air, and it changes the environment, and something changes just because of a human walks into the room. I remember when I went to see Michael Jordan play in, I think it was 2002, and when he was playing for the Wizards, we went to Georgia and watched him play the Hawks. And when I entered the room and saw him out in the court, it was just like, I felt like this heavy force come over me. I think that's the concept of glory. You know, you get this vibe from the person. Now, that's the Hebrew. Now, in Greek, it meant a little bit something different. It originally meant like expectation that you might have. An expectation. That was back in Homer's time, like in the 700s BC. Then it evolved to mean a perception. So it went from expectation that you hope for the future to a perception that you see. Then by the first century, it started to mean the opinion that you have of someone, a good opinion that you have of somebody else. And so if someone has glory, what they have is reputation. They have good reputation and honor. They have fame. They're famous. That's the idea of someone having glory in the ancient world. So if we keep these definitions in mind, actually, before we do that, I wanted you to look at just one example here in Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, verse 19. You can see this, what I'm talking about even here. Luke chapter 14, verse 19. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen. Not 19, verse 17. He says, and at the time for the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. Okay, that's messed up. So I think it's a little bit earlier than when he's talking about the banquet thing. He says in chapter 14, verse 9, he's talking about what you do at a banquet. You take the lower seat instead of the high seat. And he says, and he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this person, and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at table with you. That word honored is the same word for glory. That's the idea. So the idea there is, you'll be honored, you will have glory, because the host, the person that everybody respects his opinion and wants to have good opinion about him, he will honor you in front of everybody. That's the idea of glory. So in a sense, it's like, when we're talking about what does it mean to do something for God's glory, it means something like this: acting or behaving in such a way that the intentional goal of it is to make God famous, to make God have reputation. Something that an action will lead to people having a heavy view of God. That's the idea. Whether they will be impressed with God, whether that's because of his love or because of his wrath or whatever. Something about God they will be impressed with by your actions. It's like to attempt to raise God's reputation within the mind of someone else. You know, that's a big issue today. But look at John 11. John chapter 11, verse 4. You see this nuance here. John chapter 11, verse 4, it says, "But when Jesus heard it," they're talking about him being Lazarus dying. It says, verse 4, "But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.'" What Jesus is saying is, okay, what we're going to do with Lazarus, that's going to result in people being impressed by God. That's the idea. God's glory is going to be enhanced in these people's minds. They're going to see God in a way they haven't seen him before because of this, because of what's going to happen. So if you keep all that in mind when we're talking about 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31, and then you read back in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the rest of it, it's all about helping people see God. So let's read the rest of it. "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God." That word offense is more like be blameless. "Just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved." What's the ultimate goal of all of this? Salvation. What does it mean to do things for the glory of God? You are acting and behaving away in an intentional way that you are hoping that someone will be led to Jesus by your actions. That's the idea of doing all to the glory of God. Either someone being led to Jesus or someone or a Christian being edified from your behavior. Something for the sake of the kingdom that results in a good thing from my behavior. That's the idea. Do all to the glory of God. So you can think of with your family, with your church, with friends, with your job, with your ambitions and goals in life, with your hobbies, with your body, with your money, with vacations that you take, with your entertainment, and with your time. Why am I doing these things? Why am I acting the way I am? The goal should be because I want God to be glorified. Doing all to the glory of God. So, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Thank you for your attention.